Good afternoon. I am going to go ahead and call today's meeting to order. This is the regular Town Finance Committee for the Town of Scarborough. Today is Tuesday, May 3rd, 2022, and it is 4 p.m. Could I have the attendance, please?
Councilor Johnston,
Here.
Councilor Slider,
Here.
Councilor Anderson.
Here.
Item 3 is approval of the minutes from the April 25th, 2022 meeting. Do I have a motion?
So moved. Second.
All those in favor?
Motion passes. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Item 4 is the town manager update, and I'm going to go ahead. I was going to tee it up, but I'm going to turn it right over.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, knowing full well that as we go through the budget process, we get better information. And certainly I've been listening intently to a number of the questions raised by Finance Committee and through our online process in terms of posing questions. And so in recognition also of the need to make further changes to this budget to right size it, I've taken the liberty of putting some thoughts together that I'd like to share with you. So if Liam can share the screen. So this is just a very quick overview. You might recall your last meeting, you met with the assessing department. I think this committee took action to actually recommend delaying the in-house reval that produces a $41,000 savings. On the revenue side, and that's really where the bulk of these adjustments come from, the bottom 4 are really just improvements to our estimates. Our excise, I knew I was very conservative out of the gate. I didn't have any increase. This is just adding another 100,000. I think we'll watch this and we might be able to actually get some more as we go forward, but I don't want to go there yet. Building and electrical permits, we're on very comfortable ground in terms of where we're tracking this current year. And then the assessor made me aware of the solar exemption reimbursement. This is a new state law that we simply didn't know fully about when we put the budget together. So those are kind of 4 revenues that we just know a bit more information about. Then the top 2 categories are putting in play the rest of the downtown TIF revenue that we anticipate that will be received in the TIF fund for next year. And in hindsight, I should have programmed this for use initially, and I say that because our predictions and projections for this TIF program, we will fairly quickly reach the point where we don't have enough qualified purposes to spend the money on. And so it doesn't make sense really to keep any reserves. So I've proposed a number of different avenues to expend those additional funds. And then I think in response to Councilor Anderson's inquiry, there's also additional opportunity for spending the remaining ARPA funds. There's no reason to hold on to those. And so that's what I've brought forward. So for 3 of these items, Liam, if you go to the next, there's just a little further detail so we can talk about it. That's the actual breakdown by line item where the assessing reductions come from to the 41,000. The second category are the proposed use for downtown TIF revenues. It's a total of another $350,000. As I did initially with my proposed use of TIF revenues, I've tried to stay out of, well, I shouldn't say that. For ARPA funds, I've stayed out of the operating budget. I've tried to look at one-time capital purchases, and I'm getting ahead myself. For the downtown funds, since we do anticipate those to come in year over year, I think it's a reasonable use to cover some operating expenses. So there's additional public safety debt to be covered. There's MS4 compliance. This is stormwater compliance, which is a qualified purpose. And then the top 3 are capital items that were programmed to be appropriated. So these come right off the top, or the bottom, I guess is a better way to say it. That's the walking trail rehabilitation projects. And I think those are 2 locations. The Route 1 Marsh crossing evaluation analysis and the townwide transportation study. Again, for my own purposes, I've indicated which category they fit into for kind of compliance reasons. And this is something I just want to get accustomed to doing each and every year, so we have a good compliance trail to be able to point to. And then on the bottom, the ARPA funds, there's a fairly wide and broad allowable use. I think Liam and I need to do final confirmation with some others just to confirm that what we're proposing do qualify, but based on our understanding, they do. All these items are in the CIP program, and they were previously proposed to be appropriated. So again, that goes directly to the bottom line and reduces the amount we need to raise through taxation. So all considered, if you go to the next one. Actually, I don't think that's the right slide. No, that tax rate comp sheet includes some of the information I think the school is going to share with us. So long story short, if you are so inclined to accept these proposed changes, it reduces the amount we need to further adjust by about $600,000 in total.
So just one point of clarification, Tom. We didn't take formal action to approve the assessor being removed. Just as a formality, we did not vote on that. And in terms of the recommendations that Tom has before us today, I'm comfortable not taking formal action and kind of keeping this as our running tally. If you guys would like some more time to either process this or think about it, we can have a discussion now, certainly, with the understanding that this is what Tom is presenting as his recommendations. And as we work towards that $1.4 million number, this represents $800,000.
Yeah, I don't think you need to take action. It's fine. I just think for our collective comfort, it might be good to have that, keep track as we go, so we know where we can go if you need to.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this, Tom. Appreciate it. So from my understanding and the public's understanding, the initially proposed first read budget, we haven't really removed any items. We've just found different funding for those items. Is that correct?
The only difference would be the change in the assessing department would be a reduction of expense.
And I think
That's correct.
Finance committee said, yeah, that we will probably recommend to the town council.
Yes, so I felt comfortable bringing it forward.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Mhm.
Can you go to the very last part, William? I need a little, no, very bottom, all the way down to the bottom, into the green, there we go.
Well, I just need to disclaim that this is a bit presumptuous. This includes some additional changes to the bottom line that I think we're going to hear from the school later on.
Some spoiler alerts in there.
Right. So this is not a reflection of just your changes, suggested changes?
Yeah, frankly, I'm not sure why it's not there. It was included as part of the PDF.
This is the packet that we have.
Yes, I sent it to the 3 members of finance this afternoon.
Oh,
It's missing a page.
yeah, I don't have an additional page.
I beg your pardon. So, Councillor Johnson, to you, what's your question? Perhaps I can
Well, if
answer.
we go all the way down to the
Mhm.
bottom. So we can read it. I just need a little clarification on I know, even here, I can't read it. So let me grab my version.
I have a printed version of,
Liam can.
Yeah, if you could,
Blow it up.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think he wants the green table.
Yeah, no, I just wanted clarification because I was a little confused and I confuse easily. So at the bottom in green, we have as of May 3, 2022, town manager projected proposals, tax increase, decrease. And we show a tax rate of 15.59. On the right-hand side, the council policy. Yeah, I can read that a little better now. With the council policy being at less than 3%, I was a little confused as under the council policy 4.02.
yeah, the difference here that I think you're confusing that the council policy relates to how we calculate valuation estimate for next year. So I've chosen from the beginning to go a bit beyond, and your policy encourages me to do that when I'm comfortable.
Yep.
So we're reporting it in 2 ways, but it's not the council policy for tax rate, it's council policy for valuation assessment, estimate.
Yep.
Okay?
Does
Thank
that
you.
make sense? You
Yes.
recall Tom used to do like a high, medium.
High, medium and low,
Right.
right?
So
Yeah.
now what he's showing is where he's comfortable with the assessed value is on the left and what our policy
Okay,
dictates.
so that
he
was the
provides
policy,
is the
not the
right.
policy of 3 or below 3.
Correct.
Correct,
Right, thank you.
right, because that's not a policy, that's our council goal. Yep, that's a good clarification.
My only comment, Tom,
Mhm.
thank you for doing this, because I think those were definitely 2 outstanding things that were gonna be easy to get to some reductions with both the TIF and the ARPA.
Mhm.
I think when we go into the CIP discussion, and even as we're looking at this, I just would want to know, are there other appropriated CIP items, probably more for ARPA than for TIF, I would think at this point, that could qualify, or did you already kind of rule them all out?
I really scrutinized it carefully. I'm pleased to go back at it. ARPA does have some rules and regulations that we need to respect. And again, if we're isolating that search in those things to be appropriated, there's many bonded items that I very easily and comfortably qualify. And all things being equal, I probably would have proposed some of those, but it doesn't have the same effect on your bottom line.
And can you explain for the public, because I did ask the question, and I
Sure.
think it's just helpful, like, if we were to apply this to bonded items, it really wouldn't necessarily impact the bottom line. Can you just
Yeah, for
explain?
bonded items, it's somewhat remarkable that we'd actually bond the item as soon as next fiscal year, FY '23. If we do, and Ruth does the calculation, we do carry some additional debt service to accommodate and anticipate bonding. Frankly, the bonding that we'll do next month is for things last year or the year before, frankly. So at most, you're looking at interest expense savings. And so it's pennies on the dollar comparatively. Whereas appropriated items, dollar for dollar, you need to raise those through taxation
Yep.
or other means.
Thank you for clarifying.
So one follow-up. Again, thank you for your patience.
Mhm.
So using the different funding, certain appropriate, are there any balances left in these accounts, the ARPA or the TIF?
No,
You've done this, so we're at a zero balance anyway. So to your point, it's just maybe moving which item to
Mhm.
fund versus
Yeah.
additional
Yeah.
reduction.
And what I was
Exactly.
thinking was, like, if for some reason we decide that any of these items,
Or less of a priority or something.
and we wanted
Yeah.
to maybe move them into a further year,
Mhm.
then we could apply those ARPA funds to other appropriated things that
Right.
might be more important. But it sounds like you looked at everything and there might not be
I
many opportunities.
think once you have that discussion, I can look back at it and see if there's another way to package it to achieve the same result. So I'm pleased to take another look at it if you in fact choose to defer certain projects.
So are we in agreement as a committee that that can be part of our discussion for next Tuesday?
Mhm.
Just looking more closely. Okay,
Okay.
great. Any other questions for Tom about his update?
No questions, but thank you for putting this together, because I think it's really helpful.
Certainly, I heard some angst from some members of council of just about when we're going to make some changes. So I thought it'd be helpful to at least demonstrate a partial path forward.
Mhm.
Counselor Hamel can take the podium.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks. I think directionally, it's obviously good news. It is a little hard to kind of turn on a dime though, and to say, I'm pleased to know that the finance committee doesn't feel that they have to take any formal action after, it's like a flashcard exercise, test our short-term memory. So I'm pleased with that. But I do have a question for myself and also for the public in terms of, I know we have a meeting next Tuesday, but where do we go from here? How do we follow this to the final, to the final number? So, and I know we kind of iterate every year. And the other thing I would say is that I'm having a very hard time looking at the numbers. I couldn't really even see them sitting a few yards back, but we had 3 goals. Okay, we had 3 goals, and these was for the budget cycle. These are not necessarily council policy goals, but we had 3 targets. One was 3% or less mill rate increase. 5% or less increase in gross expenditures, and 15% or less ratio of debt service to operating costs. So With the numbers that Tom just showed us, do we see those anywhere on that sheet, or how do we connect the dots?
Sure, we can certainly make that part of our discussion on Tuesday. Absolutely. Counselor Clucci also, or Chairman Clucci also had some questions about how we calculate, how do I say it succinctly? He thought maybe we were double counting our gross expenditures. And so that actually would work in our favor if we make sure that what's being counted on the school side is not also being counted on the town side, because that obviously gets us closer to that 5% gross expenditure goal. So we can have that discussion too.
I also failed to mention, it doesn't affect your bottom line, but it'd be something that I recommend you talk about and consider in your final actions. I've had further thought about the library capital project, and this is true of any large capital project, and we've done it inconsistently through the years. Because the voters, in my opinion, the voters rule supreme. They're the ones that control and actually grant the appropriation authority. Your budget order really ought to not have the council appropriate that money. You don't have the authority to do so. So I'll be recommending that the amount that's being requested for the library be removed from your budget approval, because it's really the voters that are the only ones that can grant that authority. So it's really it's a change to the budget order itself. And I suppose it's a change to your CIP.
Do we have a policy, Tom, that dictates in terms of keeping that consistent? Because to your point, we put the turf track in the CIP knowing that that was going to have to go to referendum. And now you're suggesting that we take something that we think is going to have to go to.
I don't know that
referendum
it's
out of the CIP.
inappropriate either way. I would like to have a consistent
Sure.
way of doing it, frankly.
maybe that's
Public
something-
safety, we didn't include it, for instance.
Yeah, so that's definitely something for the council to consider.
Quite precisely. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Counselor Hammerl agreed with me for the record.
Let the minutes reflect.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments?
Nope.
Okay, so with that, we will move on to item 5, which is a discussion of our department review. And today we have Chief Holmquist here to discuss the police department.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Holmquist. I'm the police chief, town of Scarborough, and to my right is Deputy Chief David Grover. Provide an overview of our department. Currently, we have 39 sworn personnel with 1 vacancy, which we hope to fill within the next couple of weeks. Within that 39 sworn personnel, we have a patrol division, a detective bureau, a special enforcement unit, as well as our community resource team. That is what comprises our 39 sworn personnel. In our dispatch center, we have 13 full-time dispatchers. That includes our dispatch manager, as well as our data support specialist, who was just recently hired. We do have 2 part-time dispatchers who help out and fill some vacancies out when they are available and when they come on. We have 2 administrative assistants, 1 social services navigator, 1 animal control officer who supports not only our town, but also Westbrook, 1 Marine resources officer, and 12 personnel assigned to the fire police. This team last year responded to approximately 29,000 calls for service. That's a 3,000 call for service increase over our COVID year 2020. And for comparison's sake, pre-COVID in 2019, calls for service that our department responded to was 31,000. We do have 8 officers who are eligible for retirement, 7 of which have between 30 and 35 years of service. So that is of concern for me, considering that we, as a profession, as an entire profession of law enforcement, especially in the state of struggle to hire people to backfill these vacancies. I hope they don't all decide to retire at once, but we do have 2 that are scheduled to retire in July and in August respectively. And the last bullet on the overview, I'd like to celebrate our community survey results with to talk about the public safety team between ourselves and the fire department. 92% of our community members who were surveyed were satisfied with the level of service that both departments provided to them, and they felt safe living in town, which means a lot to us as first responders. Next slide. So the budget drivers for this fiscal year, the overall budget increase is 5.5% for police services. Majority of that is the request for 2 additional police officers, which was $176,000 within the budget. We also had training cost increases from approximately $666 devoted to training per officer for this current FY, and then it's projected out to $806 per officer for this proposed FY. And that's based off of 36 officers. The administrative, myself, the deputy chief, and the 2 lieutenants are not included in that count. These training costs, they include the tuition, lodging, and meal coverage for our officers to attend training. We had some contractual increases through the signed contracts for both police and dispatch in 2021, as well as you all have heard, through the several departments reporting out the inflation costs in fuel, supplies, and services. Next slide. All right, responding to community needs. We were pleased with the feedback from the community survey, but we don't dwell on those results. We look to get better and expand upon our success each and every day. And some of the things that were highlighted here were areas that we can improve upon, and they were still ranked within between 54 and 70% of those surveyed being either very satisfied or satisfied with the level of service our department provided. Some of the things that were identified were the visibility in the neighborhoods, as well as business areas. The public wanted to see us out and about more so in the neighborhoods and businesses. And one of the things that we did that didn't cost us anything, a few months ago, if you recall, on our social media, we identified a need to respond to the community survey, and one of our sergeants came up with the idea of having cruise mode lights activated when we're in lower visibility situations at night, going throughout our neighborhoods and within our business areas, just to provide a solid blue light on either end of the light bar to give people a level of assurance that we are there and some level of comfort. So. Also identified was public safety educational outreach, and that's just not with our kids in the schools, but also it could be any group within town, whether it be in a group setting or individual setting. Every chance that our officers have to communicate with the public is a chance to educate, and we take that very seriously. Enforcement of local traffic laws. We are busy going back and forth calls for service. We have a very busy Payne Road corridor as well as Route 1, and our normal shift coverage is 3 police officers and 1 supervisor. That's on a good day. Sometimes we run a little lighter than that with 2 officers and a supervisor. So local traffic enforcement is something we need to improve on, and we're coming up with ways in which to do that. Crime prevention was another thing that was identified as a place that we could improve upon. And I think having a special enforcement unit as well as a detective bureau that's capable of responding to our community needs is important. We have very talented personnel within both of those groups, as well as our community resource group, who, they'll draw information about criminal activity that's going on within neighborhoods or around businesses within town that they can provide to our detective bureau and special enforcement. And then the last bullet is something that I added that wasn't particularly drawn from the community survey, but it's something that these survey results are directly impacted by our community engagement over several generations. And we receive a lot of support from our community, and we truly appreciate that. But that's something that, again, we will not dwell on, and we will continue to improve upon each and every contact with the community. Out of this list, the top 3 priorities for those folks that were surveyed: visibility in neighborhoods, enforcement of local traffic laws, and crime prevention were the top 3 things they wanted us to concentrate on. Next slide. New initiatives, 2 new police officer positions. Again, those 2 positions will likely go to the day and evening shifts, where majority of our calls for service are received on a daily basis. And they will help supplement our existing staff in trying to cover down on the identified needs that I just mentioned on the previous slide. Also like to highlight our lead case manager grant position that we received from the Department of Justice a few months ago. We're due to hire somebody for that position within the next few weeks. And we're really excited to see this person go to work with our social services navigator to expand upon what this program is all about. And again, it's to help out those folks that have some unmet needs, whether it's through substance use or mental health issues, and trying to get them pointed in the right direction and get them the services that they need. To date, we've had 9 referrals. Again, we're looking to expand upon that once the lead case manager gets in place and can help our very busy social services navigator, who does a lot for us in addition to overseeing this program. Next slide. So the key capital investments, it's a $92,000 list of items that we've prioritized for this fiscal year, this upcoming fiscal year. Polygraph equipment, we've had the same polygraph equipment since 2002. So the idea is to take the existing equipment and use it towards the trade-in value for a new apparatus. The SWAT portable radios. Currently, we have 3 police officers who are assigned to the SWAT team, which also includes officers from South Portland and Cape Elizabeth PD. The radios that we brought to the team were not compatible with what South Portland has transitioned to. So our officers are using hand-me-down South Portland PD radios. They're older radios, and we're starting to have issues. So as you may imagine, when the stress is on, the last thing you want to fail is your radio. So that's an identified priority. Utility vehicle replacement. That's a routine replacement program that's been in place since fiscal year 2003. And it's just a normal routine maintenance and replacement program where we swap out 1 vehicle per year, and we get a fairly new used vehicle, if that makes any sense. And we try to do that per year. And then the last item is the interior and exterior lighting at the co-op for the restrooms. Currently, there's no power to that building, and for safety reasons and the amount of traffic that's down there in the summertime, our Marine Resource Officer has identified that as a priority, and we do as well. Next slide. So the 2 new officer positions, they're there to meet the current needs, and truly they are there with the amount of calls for service that we have, the amount of traffic in town, the identified needs from the community survey. And, realistically, 2 officers is something I can tell you with a straight face is what we could likely hire given our pending retirements, especially the 2 that are upcoming this summer. Any additional headcount beyond the 2 new positions, realistically, with the way we're struggling, not only us, but also other agencies in hiring, I can't come before this panel and tell you that we'd be able to hire 4. I don't think that's realistic. In addition to projected vacancies that may be coming up next FY. So the two new officers will be applied to cover down on the traffic enforcement issues, the presence issue, crime prevention, and also the educational outreach. And then the final bullet here is on training, and we invest a lot in training, and we think that the increase in training is something that is much needed, especially with the challenges that law enforcement faces today. Whenever anything happens and it's a critical incident, one of the things that has been scrutinized, at least through my 25 years of experience, has been the level of an officer's training. So we always either rise or fall to the level of our training. And we want to make sure that when the call comes and we need to respond to a critical incident, that we have the training and experience in place to serve our community the best that we can. With that, I'll take your questions.
Questions? Ken, go for it.
Thank you for the presentation.
Yes.
You guys have been running too lean, too long, and I heard you. And do you really think you could not hire more than two? Because my position is we need more than two. And the reason why I say that is I went out, I had the privilege to go out and ride with one of your sergeants one evening, just so I could get a look and feel about what your folks go through every day. We did what's the evening shift, 4 to 11? I bailed at 10 because I was exhausted. And I said, I do not understand how these folks do this every night. And I had to stay in the car. Okay, that was the protocol. Protocol was, Counselor Johnson, you cannot get out of the car. I said, okay. But still, it was emotional, it was draining. Your team is very well trained. They interact with the public regardless of the situation, very professionally. But I saw that night how thin you are run with the concentric circles around the way that we divided up the town. And then we have a sergeant that backfills if somebody gets a call and all that. It's very interesting. So the two that you mentioned that you need, are they going to be there to backfill the typical shift cycle, for lack of a better term? Or are they going to be dedicated to what the survey says? Folks want to see a presence in the neighborhood. And I'll tell you, folks really want to see people stopping cars. And I know there's a PR move with that. But if you're doing 50 and a 35, you deserve a ticket. So you sure you can't do more than two? Or use more than two?
Well,
Or hire more than two?
I could definitely give it my best shot. I just come before we, like I said, with a straight face, knowing that the challenges that are, projected with the vacancies, if,
Yeah,
worst case
coming.
scenario, if we had 8 officers retire tomorrow, that's 8 additional vacancies, to include the 2 that hopefully we gain through this budget process. So the likelihood of us backfilling every position,
So
gonna be
in
challenging.
the way you're thinking on the 2 that you want to add, are they going to be fairly dedicated to the survey results? I actually watched your interview with Let's Talk Scarborough, and you brought up the survey several times, which I appreciated, and everybody watching, I'm sure appreciated. So will they be dedicated to the presence in the neighborhood and traffic management?
they'll,
So what the goal is?
yes, sir. They'll be, backfilled to the either day or evening shift. And we require all of our officers to address everything within the survey results. So they'll join a team that's already striving to do that. To say that we're going to have 2 officers dedicated to just address that and not respond to calls for service, that won't happen. I wish we could have more of a special enforcement effort like that, but right now, just due to the capacity and the amount of calls for service coming in, with mental health as well as substance use, those require additional time on scene. And I think the reason why you see some of the numbers, the 2019 numbers being a couple thousand more than what last year's numbers are, is because our officers are taking the extra time at these calls to triage what they have so that they can point the person in the right direction or get them hooked up with our social services navigator. So that takes additional time. These are complex situations that our officers deal with, and they do a great job, and I appreciate you highlighting that. But that also takes away from being proactive. And, pre-COVID, our officers likely had more time to go out and do traffic enforcement and create more things on their own in a proactive manner, which would lead to more calls for service.
And I know, the newer thing in town is that we're dealing with a lot of transient folks that are trying to get some housing, which we're a very welcoming community we want, but the services aren't being provided. So we're also suffering from the results of that. So anytime during the year you feel you need more, I don't know procedurally how that's done, but please reach out, because I can see the demand rising over time on that component and pulling away from the need of, again, trying to satisfy some of the survey results. So, but again, thank you for your presentation. I think you guys are great. You've run lean too long, and thank you for coming forward and asking for some additional resources to help you do your job.
Thank you, Council.
I don't have many questions, but maybe something that you can help me understand better when it comes to our revenues and the costs. Like, how much of our costs as a department are we dedicating or supporting other communities? And do you feel like we're getting sufficient revenues from those communities to support that? Or are we as a town subsidizing that more?
Deputy Chief.
The two things right offhand I can think of are our animal control program, where we're working with Westbrook and they're paying us to share that service. And then our marine resource officer also works with Cape Elizabeth. I think some of the computation, as far as it's not as easy as call for call, as the chief mentioned, just like our police calls, some of them are more time consuming, but we do go through an exercise to try to determine a good offsetting cost for revenue, but that also benefits us. The other thing we try to keep in mind at all times is we don't want to see a diminished service to the citizens of the town of Scarborough, so that if the call volume or the burden that the other communities are creating are too great, and we have not increased manpower with either of those positions in order to accommodate either Westbrook or Cape Elizabeth, that we're utilizing the same manpower that we were utilizing just for Scarborough. So we're making our best educated guess that revenue amount, but I do believe that the town is benefiting money-wise, as well as not seeing any reduction in service to our own citizens.
I can add to that.
Yeah.
As well, Councilor Anderson. We also have agreements with the town of Old Orchard and the town of Buxton for dispatch services. And next year is a contract year for them, so that's certainly a revenue increase for us as well.
I remember that was a big topic of conversation last year in budget, was dispatch, and similar conversation of, are we fully having those partner communities cover those costs appropriately to make sure that they're paying their fair share, so that doesn't fall necessarily on Scarborough taxpayers. So thank you guys for answering that. I'm super excited about the lead case navigator. So that's super exciting, super supportive of the two new hires. I also want to thank you guys for recently posting the police logs and making those publicly available. I know that was something a lot of residents wanted to see, so I appreciate you guys doing that. So now I'm going to ask the question I don't want to ask, because we started off the meeting with Tom kind of acknowledging that we have about $600,000 that we need to find in the budget. So where, Chief, do you see any opportunities for potentially deferring things, or how would you help us address that so that we, again, don't unnecessarily move things around that we shouldn't? You know, I personally feel like you guys gave us a pretty lean request this year, so I might be asking a question that I already know the answer to, but, you know, would appreciate any guidance you could give us in terms of if we had to make some tough choices, where would you suggest we make those?
Well, I would agree that we've submitted a lean budget, and I know we've gone line by line a few times, not only for my own education, being a new police chief, new to this department, but just to make sure that we're cutting appropriately where we can and raising appropriately because of a need that we absolutely cannot do without. You know, the two new officers, that's definitely something that needs to remain on the table. In the training, I've already emphasized how important training is. You can increase headcount, but if you don't have the training to follow up with that, a good quality, realistic training, then that's going to be detrimental in the future. So that's a great question. I wish I had the answer to. I defer to my team if they know of any holes in the budget that we could potentially cut.
One of the other challenges we're facing, just because I have some historical knowledge, is that in other years when we have been able to realize additional personnel, we've made either no additions or gains in areas like training and equipment. And we're really at a point right now for liability purposes and for what's being asked of us by society to not cut those other areas, which only leaves those two new personnel. And I agree, as Councilor Johnson mentioned, that those are needed personnel. I know that doesn't help you in this budget process, and I apologize for that, but
That's okay.
we're in-
That's okay.
That's what I.
We're here to do the
That's
hard
how I
job.
would have
That's
answered it
okay.
too, so.
Yeah.
Yep, which
And
is,
and
you
it's
had to
worth,
ask.
it's worth noting that a couple of the things that Tom was able to identify to be reappropriated are
Right.
services for fire and safety. And
Yeah.
so, you know, there is a little bit of movement there just in how we may be able to fund those things, but, you know, those are the hard questions that, you know, we're gonna have to look at, and I can appreciate the honest answer is zero.
Yeah.
Well, I would simply say if the finance committee and the council gets to the point where you are looking for reductions, I would hope you provide that directive to me and allow me to work with my senior staff
Of course.
to identify areas. I mean, the question is being asked of the police department, but it really should be asked across the entire operation. And so, you know, myself with the senior staff, I think have a better insight across the organization as to where reductions of a certain magnitude are best to come from.
Point well taken.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen, for
Thank you.
joining us
Thank you.
today and for your presentation.
All right, thank you very much.
We will go ahead and turn the floor over to Chief Kindlin of the Fire Department.
These guys travel in packs.
Yeah.
Important
We all have
numbers.
the same wardrobe. Very important.
You
that
guys are
we all
dressed
would
nicely
be here.
too.
Yeah,
It's like, should have dressed up. Yeah. I know.
welcome, gentlemen.
This is how they look every day.
Try to. Thank you so much for having us today. It's certainly my pleasure as your new fire chief for the town of Scarborough to sit in front of you and be able to present our budget on behalf of our team. And I'm excited to be able to have this opportunity today. So we'll jump right in on our first slide. So just a quick overview of the Scarborough Fire Department. A lot of you have been brought up in the town. You understand we are an all hazards fire department. We don't just respond to fires, as many of you know. We also respond to emergency medical services. We are your emergency management agency for planning and mitigation of hazards. We do our fire prevention, and we also do handle the fire suppression part of the equation, which is usually interrupts us once in a while. The fires are so far and few between lately, thankfully, that the other stuff really takes up most of our work. Our budget's made up of 5 sub-budgets, which is the administration, which covers myself as the fire chief. I have 2 deputies. I have a full-time and a part-time fire prevention officer. And we have 2 administrative assistants that are also under that budget. The suppression budget, which is operated by Deputy Chief Lamoria. Emergency medical services budget, which is currently being operated under Deputy Chief Duross. Our fire prevention budget, we are super fortunate to have Captain Brennan backfilling when we lost Captain, oh my goodness, Butler, Captain Butler about a year ago. He stepped in and really took us to the next step and helped us maintain our planning and our good parts. And then the emergency management budget, which is really a collateral duty, but it does, with the pandemic, it took on a whole different face. We really were engaged heavily at the emergency management level. So those are, our budget is made up of 5 sub-budgets. Our goals this year and our priorities are to stabilize the workforce by continued implementation of our staffing plan. The last revision was done by my predecessor, Chief Thurlow, but this staffing plan has been on the table and been available since 2008 with several different iterations being provided to the council, and different times we've been able to make progress. Other years we haven't been able to, but it is a clear staffing plan that is available on the website, and I believe it's probably in your packets as well if you had it. The other part that we're trying to do is we're trying to maintain acceptable response times. On our own review and research, we've been noticing that response times have started to creep up over the last few years. And we've drawn some conclusions, but I think it was very serendipitous that the survey mentioned how people really enjoyed and were pleased with our response times and how we responded to their calls, whether it was medical or fire calls or other calls for service for us. So this really kind of jumped to the top of the list because we want to make sure that we don't start taking a step back from what the community has told us that they are pleased with. And then the management of escalation of costs for fuel and essential supplies. As many businesses and anybody else out there know, that the supply chain is absolutely crazy. And we just are trying to manage those difficulties and those challenges the best we can. Next slide. So our major budget drivers for fiscal year 23, obviously the top one is 4 full-time career positions, which we're going to use to maintain the authorized on-duty staffing and stabilize our workforce. To give that just a little bit of a tee up is the 4 full-time staff, we are facing the same challenges that the police department has in hiring and recruiting and retaining folks. We are lucky that our full-time staff of 32 members, there is very little turnover in there, but we do have a significant turnover and a real struggle with our per diem staff, those folks that pick up shifts here and there and help us supplement our staffing. We've really run into kind of a roadblock with that, and we're not able to keep some of our station staffed on a regular basis. And it's starting to affect the level of service that we've always enjoyed in the town of Scarborough. Obviously, we also negotiated a collective bargaining agreement with our fire union last year, and those contractual salary increases are in the CBA along with some of the COLAs that were provided to non-union staff in our organization. We operate out of 6 stations. I put 5 station utilities because, to be honest, Ken Kennedy really manages the public safety building alongside with, so I don't have all the intimate details about what the costs are for that. And I know that there's some shared services that are done there. So I just labeled the 5 stations. Propane and electricity is absolutely crazy for what the increases are being projected for next year. And then the same as all the other, I'm sure the other folks are going to sit in front of you and say the same thing. Vehicle fuels, gasoline and diesel, we're all paying it on our own. So those are some of the big budget drivers for us. Next slide. So responding to our community needs, the recent community service did place, as I spoke of, it's placed a high value on the fire and EMS response times. As a note to the committee, we are starting to see a pretty significant increase in those response times. I think we found some of the reasons for that is some of our stations, our neighborhood stations, are going unstaffed when they're normally staffed, which means another station is responding to that area to take care of those incidents and make sure those calls for service are taken care of. Now, the response times aren't significant that we're super worried yet, but if we do not do something to try and put a barrier to that, our response times are going to continue to increase. And I think we looked at it over 3 years. the last 3 years, and it was close to a 20% increase in our response times, which is concerning to us. The rise in call volume, we've increased call just over 1 year. We went up over 300 calls, and we had a little lull at the beginning of the pandemic. We had between the months of March and April and the beginning of the pandemic, there was a 37% decrease in call volume for our ambulance service. And it was simply related to people didn't want to go out. They didn't want to go to the hospital. They were afraid of catching COVID. And we saw a pretty precipitous dip in our call volume. We got a little worried. But soon after, with some of the things that were put in place, the calls for service due to the additional population that has moved into Scarborough, our call volume went right through the roof. Our folks are running on average 15 to 20 calls in a 24-hour period on the ambulance. And each one of those calls takes about an hour to 90 minutes, depending on the acuity of that call with the ambulance. And then you sprinkle in the fire calls for the alarms, the fire inspections, all of that other stuff. They're very busy during the day. And so the rising call volume with that inability to fill the authorized per diem shifts will continue to have a negative impact on response times if we don't look at that staffing that we're asking for. And the additional full-time staffing maintains on-duty staffing available for responses. I think it's on the next slide. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the new initiative, as I said, is the 4 additional firefighters. And operationally, that's just adding 1 firefighter. We have 4 platoons that rotate on an 8-day cycle to cover 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So essentially 1 FTE really essentially takes 4 people to fill that 1 FTE so that we have even coverage across all the platoons and the shifts. So I could probably package it to you and say it's 1 position, but it really is 4 people to try and fill that position. What we did this year is we took a look at our per diem, because we're having such difficulty retaining and recruiting per diems, and a lot of them are not as reliable. A lot of the per diem program isn't as reliable as it used to be. We looked at offsetting some of that cost. So what we did is we deleted some of the hours out of what's called the day firefighter schedule. We deleted 24 hours a day out of the day firefighter schedule that we would normally pay to a per diem, and we converted that to 1 full-time position. So that 24 hours a day will be covered by a full-time person each day. That approximate net cost, as I was figuring back, I think it's changed a little bit as I've done some numbers, but it's right about the $144,000. The entire ask is $326,000, but when you do the conversion, we're looking at about $144,000 ask for those 4 positions with that conversion. And the new positions only ensure the on-duty staffing levels are maintained and also temper overtime costs for both full-time and per diem vacancies. None of us want to leave an open hole in one of the neighborhood stations. We want to make sure that the fire truck, the AED, all those things get out in an appropriate time. So there are times when overtime or other things are used to fill those stations, which is not a cost-effective way of maintaining our service. Next slide. Switching over to key capital investments. We had a few capital investments that I thought we would mention. I'm very pleased to announce Deputy Lamoria and Chief Thurlow, prior to his leaving, were able to acquire a $439,000 assistance to firefighter grant. We've been carrying, I think it was $625,000 when I looked. We've been carrying a capital item for several years because we knew that our Scott Air Packs, our SCBAs that we use to breathe in a hazardous environment, were going to term out this year. And with the diligent work by the deputy and Chief Thurlow, they were able to get that grant. There is a local match, and with the local match, and we are going to have some upgrade costs to retrofit the trucks to make sure the new type of bottles fit, all those types of things, came to $70,000 rather than $600 and something thousand. We're in the process. We've gone through the bid process. All the things have been ordered, and we're on time to be able to have those in place for the fiscal year if this passes. The second item is replacing all portable radios. I can go over the same argument that Chief Holmquist said. Our radios are over 15 years old. We are starting to have issues with them, not able to get them repaired, not be able to find components to repair them. And as a matter of fact, our firefighters, our labor organization has even provided us with some letters of concern about how the radio system has worked. And it's something that I think needs to be addressed and this year if we can. The big one on our capital plan is replacing 2 of our ambulances utilizing ARPA funds at the tune of $650,000. If you told me 10 years ago I'd be spending $325,000 in an ambulance, I would have told you you're crazy. But the price escalation on steel and all the other things, it's just through the roof. And that's why we made a request early on in the process when the town manager asked us for ideas for ARPA funds, that we asked for that to try and be covered through that. The big thing that we're struggling with, and the reason why we need to we have I think it's a 45 or 50-year-old vehicle replacement plan that's been on the books for many, many years. Chief Thurlow has massaged that over the years as well. But this, we were in line to replace 1 ambulance anyway this year. We would have normally asked for 1, but because of the wear and tear from the pandemic, the increased call volume, the trucks that we currently have are very high mileage. They're starting to cost us more money in maintenance. And the big part of that is the lead times to get a truck. We're looking at 12 to 14 months to even see an ambulance, even if you told us we could get one today, which is going to set our plan way behind if we don't start doing something a little earlier. And the ARPA funds, I think, were a really good tie-in to try and get that done. And then another large number on there was major station maintenance and upkeep. We've had a plan. Chief Thurlow has had a plan for many years, and we replace overhead doors on some of our 5 stations and things like that. Kitchen sinks, doing plumbing just to keep the stations up and going well. So that's what that money is for. Next slide. As I said earlier, the fiscal year budget requests this year are simply essential to maintain our current services. If we ignore this and continue to rely on the per diem program, we may get ourselves into a pickle where our response times start to suffer. And as I said, the full-time positions do not add to our on-duty staffing. They're simply converting staff that we've already been authorized by the council in the past with the day firefighters from per diem to full-time. And lastly, the future budget should give consideration to additional full-time staff to be proactive in managing the increasing service demands. One of the things that I think that with Deputy Duross, he started just a few weeks ago, and the new deputy that will be starting at the end of the summer, is we really want to take a look at that staffing plan. The staffing plan is well done, but I think it had some assumptions in there that things didn't really change as far as how we operate, how we deploy. I think there's some more pieces that we can be taking a look at as a new senior staff to say, are we deploying appropriately? Do we have the stations in the right place? All those things need to be considered to move the staffing plan forward. So, and that's my, jumping in January right into budget season, I didn't have the opportunity to spend as much time as I would have liked to call some of that stuff out for you folks, but that is definitely a priority for this coming year for us. Next slide. Questions?
I'm actually going to start. I never do. Can you explain, and this may be a question for Tom, can you explain a little bit about the revenue that you generate from EMS calls? And I know you had said you had seen a dip at the start of the pandemic, which makes sense. People didn't want to go and risk getting COVID. And I know that typically we would use revenues to help with our vehicle replacement plan. So we're always trying not to fall off a cliff whenever we use something like ARPA money. So can you speak a little bit how is that revenue calculated, or what is that something that we as a town set for costs or fees?
So we do set a certain amount of revenue that we give back to the town, I believe, offset taxation. And in the past, we did reduce it during the pandemic from 1.25 down to 1.15, simply to try and buffer some of those losses. The good news is we did gain, so we went through some grant processes and through Homeland Security, we're able to get some relief from some of the losses from EMS. And those revenues having started to increase. One of the things I answered to Councilor Johnson's questions is I was very conservative about increasing those revenues this year. I think we are trending that those revenues are going to be more than what I put in the budget. But again, as the new guy, I was concerned to overpromise and underdeliver. So again, with our call volume increasing over 300%, each call is billed based on the service provided, whether it's a basic life support, advanced life support, and the patient actually pays for that service, or the insurance company. So that's how we get that revenue. And then we come up with a formula. I worked with Ruth this year to learn where we were at with our revenues. And we decided that it was going to be best to leave the revenue where it was, just so I can under promise and over deliver.
Just to further expand, historically, our we'd always been able to make the capital purchase of ambulances using EMS revenues, and essentially the additional revenue left over came to offset operational expense. We do fully intend and expect to get back to that. It's fortuitous having this ARPA money to help us get over this bridge this little gap, because it's really kind of 2 years of less than expected EMS revenue. But as Chief mentions, I think we're well back on track and should be able to fund those capital items with EMS revenues going forward.
And go ahead. It is a very true statement, what you said about the town and the department are able to set the rates.
Mhm.
However, there are federal and state caps and limits to that, so that we have to stay within those.
Yep.
And so it isn't free reign.
Perfect.
And one of the other, and I appreciate you reminding me, one of the other pieces I responded to Counselor Johnson's questions was, I'm sorry, Counselor Anderson's questions was, last year at I think in the fall, the legislature passed a no surprise billing law that kind of made us go into contracts with insurance companies and accept what they pay us. And while we only had one insurance company that actually fell under that reign, or we had to do that, our Comstar, our billing company that bills for us, says that we're still on track, that things are good. But again, I was concerned about what that outcome was going to be with that new law change. So another reason why we didn't raise revenue, just to make sure that we find out what the real experience is going to be from that new law.
Excellent. Thank you. Other questions? Ken, go ahead.
If you don't mind, for me and the general public, could you just give a brief overview of the per diem concept and what does that mean?
You want to speak to that? I know, sure. So the town of Scarborough had a very, very robust per diem program that worked very, very well for many, many years. They were one of the first in the states to do this. In the past, the full-time career staffing was used to staff just ambulances, and per diem staffing was used to staff the fire apparatus. We've evolved a lot over the last, incredibly in the last 5 years. When I was hired about 4 years ago, one of the two projects I was given by former Chief Thurlow was to redo the staffing plan and to redo the apparatus replacement plan. So we did those two things. It was very evident in there with the per diem program that it is dependent upon part-time help. You know, it is a part-time employment. And we were very.
It's on demand, is that correct? The per diem?
We have per diems that are scheduled for, they have shifts that are scheduled, either scheduled by the day of the week, or we schedule them on a rotation so that they work alongside the full-time employees. We've had a very good success rate. What has changed, and we started to address this in the 2019 revision of the staffing plan, was the fact that most of the departments in the state of Maine are either increasing their career staff, or they're increasing or implementing per diem programs. And when those other communities implement those per diem programs, a lot of the employees that we had that traveled, when we were the only game in town, they traveled to us. Well, it became much more advantageous for them to serve their own communities. And we've seen a significant drop in the last 5 years as more and more of those departments have implemented other per diem programs or have hired more full-time staffing. In the end of it, there are a finite number of fire and EMS workers in the state of Maine. I say it's finite, but the availability has outpaced the need for them, and we're not alone in that struggle. The one thing that I will say that's very important about our request this year, we see this as critical to just maintaining our current on-duty staffing, and that is quite different from other requests in the staffing plan before. Most of those you saw that where we added a full-time position to take care of a observed or demonstrated need. The best example, the last 4 we hired were career supervisors because of the new station and the amount of people that had to be supervised there. With this request, it is merely We need them on board to help to fill the gaps of positions that we already currently staff to maintain the services that we have. One last thing before I close though about that staffing plan that's vitally important is, so I was a very large part of redoing the staffing plan in 2019. Was started in 18, finished it in 19. There's missing information there. And that missing information is a history of the last 2 years in the pandemic and how that has decimated our ability especially in per diem. When we're dealing with people who are working full-time in other agencies in the state, or they have other jobs, they just were in a position where they're not willing to risk an exposure for a part-time employment. And I think that the realities of the workforce generally in the state of Maine across the nation demand a lot of adjustment in the staffing plan that from 2019.
Do keep in mind, these per diem staff are typically career firefighters, professionally trained, highly credentialed. They're full-time with someone else, another agency, and they're picking up extra shifts with us. And presumably many of our career professional firefighters do the same in other departments as well.
Right. No, thanks for that, because I've been in town since '84, and I think I walked in with you and I told you, when I was in town, we were a full volunteer fire department, right? But those days are gone. So volunteer, you kind of get the sense those are people that actually live in the local community to volunteer for the fire department. So then the per diem comes in. That's why I was glad for the explanation. That is actually trying to get other bodies from other communities to come in to fill the slots, because we don't have the local folks wanting to volunteer or even per diem. And now those communities are also offering per diem programs. So they'd rather stay home than drive into Scarborough. So thank you for that. So out of the 4 full-time replacements need, what does that do with the ratio of per diems? How many per diem, what's the demand on the per diem that will get absorbed by the full-time?
So essentially, they're going to cover 24 hours of per diem, part-time hours that are normally scheduled with a per diem or part-time person. That full-timer will assume that role for that 24-hour period. That 24 hours could be filled with one per diem for 12 hours, another one for the other 12. They're essentially just stepping into that role. We have not got down to the weeds on exactly where we're going to put them, on how that
They're
operational.
allocated. Yeah.
Actually, the quick answer to that is typically it would be filling shifts that are currently going vacant because we can't fill them.
And we were at 14% when I last looked. Julie did some numbers for me. 14% of our per diem shifts have been going vacant this year.
Yeah.
Which is,
No, I definitely support you. Here's a question. You're safe here with your answers. What's driving the rise in the volume?
well, I think this town does have a fair amount of healthcare facilities. One of the other things that I didn't mention, we do have a private ambulance company that's in this community that tries to keep up with non-emergency work. All the towns around us are being kind of sucked into backfill. They can't staff their ambulances. They can't keep their stuff going. So we're getting more calls that aren't normally something that we would get, that call you. Maine Medical Center is calling us more often. The Enclave, all those nursing homes that we operate with are calling us because they know when they dial 911, we show up right away. They call a private, they may have to wait 3 hours to move a patient from one place to the other. So
We have shared services also with other towns. Is that correct? With our
mutual aid, yes, we do provide mutual aid.
And that's revenue based also, right?
Sure.
They pay us, we pay them.
So we only bill patients. We don't, the one thing we do bill other towns for, we have a program that doesn't create a ton of revenue, but paramedic intercepts. So if some of the smaller towns out towards the west are coming through, going to the hospital and they have a really acute case, they'll call for us to provide them with a paramedic to intercept them, and we charge them accordingly for that.
Well, the new ambulances, I definitely am pleased with, and definitely good use for the ARPA, because it's a one-time fee. It's ARPA, it's approved money. So good job for our town manager doing that for you. So.
And those ambulances transported nearly 200 COVID patients over the last couple of years, positive COVID patients. So they clearly were used for the pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for your service. Similar topic that Chief Holmquist addressed. I'm just curious, do we have the similar risk with pending retirements in the fire department like we had in the police department?
Only one.
Just one? Just one? Okay. So that's.
No, really though, we're about 4 or 5 years out before we see that tipping point. We do have one captain, a senior staff member who is close and could go anytime, but he's given us some assurities that he'll be here for a couple of years. But I think we're gonna be there soon.
Okay. And then I think Counselor Johnson kind of addressed it, but I'm curious because I just Googled volunteer firefighters and saw that Yarmouth still has an active volunteer firefighter program. Is that something that we've done in the past or considered doing to just try and help offset some of the needs?
So we still have, rather than strictly volunteer, our call force is still active and they do respond.
Okay.
And we take great steps to try to foster that. A couple of programs that we have are Fire Explorers, which is a recruitment tool for our call companies. And along with that is our student intern program is a recruitment tool for not only our call company, but our per diem force and typically full-time appointments. So we still do that and we still support that. The one thing that should be considered with that is for the survey values our response time. The one thing that impacts our response time the most is on-duty staffing, people who are in the station ready to respond when the call comes in. It has become increasingly more difficult for our call firefighters to respond in a very quick manner, just based on traffic and call volumes. We typically utilize our call firefighters for periods of time where we get really busy. We ask for them to come to the station to staff equipment while our career folks are transporting people to the hospital. And then on our larger calls where we need more people. And we have a very good response. We had a fire recently in the Pleasant Hill area that came in at about midnight, and we had about 25 call firefighters respond to that incident. And that is a very good response, and it's very solid. The real difference though is to maintain our response time, we have to maintain on-duty presence.
And this phenomenon with call divisions is nationwide. I mean, it's worldwide, frankly, I suspect. But the rigors of training that are now required, the fact that folks don't have the luxury necessarily to work in the same community that they live, just all of those factors together really make it increasingly challenging. And I guess the final thing would be just their skill set doesn't necessarily match up with our need. When we're running majority EMS calls, many folks are willing to serve their community kind of in the fire capacity. There's more they can give on that side. The need doesn't exist like it used to.
I have a follow-up.
Yes.
This is just a general question that I've always wondered, and if I do, I'm sure several others, because I'm just a regular guy. When I live over here at Juneberry and I work on my front part, so I always see you guys come down the new road out to Sawyer and go off. But when you typically see a fire engine, you think fire. So what is the protocol? When does the fire engine go out? Because it's not necessarily a fire, right? So again, just a general explanation. When do the fire engines go out?
So we enjoy a very great partnership with our dispatchers who are licensed emergency medical dispatchers that assess a case as the call comes in and determine what the acuity of that case is. And there's actually a level A, B, C, D, and E, E being the most acute, A being the most minor type of call. And based on what that call, where they program that call into, determines whether or not a fire truck goes, whether or not 2 ambulances go, whether or not the captain goes as well. You'll likely see on a cardiac arrest, you'll see 2 police cars, a fire truck, 2 SUVs, because we treat a cardiac arrest just like it's a fire. We throw everything at it to give everybody the best chance they can. So that is a very measured approach. The dispatchers take questions and they plug it into an algorithm, and that spits out, this is what you need to send. It's very, it's well done. And we follow the same thing. Old Orchard does the same thing with our dispatchers, and that's how we come to that determination.
And I will say that some of our staffing realities here today have lent us to more use of fire trucks for that response. And I'll have to explain that, but we have invested in small utility vehicles to try to handle the ambulance assist calls. That worked very well when we had full staffing, on-duty staffing, because we could send 2 people on that and still have somebody back for the fire truck. When we have situations where we have vacancies in the schedule and holes, and if we only have 2 people left to go, we end up having to take the fire truck only because if a fire comes in while they're on that incident, we have to be able to respond very quickly. So we have addressed that with the use of smaller utility vehicles, but our difficulty with filling on-duty staff kind of impacts our ability to use them.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you, guys.
Great.
Thank you.
Counselor
sorry.
Hammer would like to take the podium.
This comment goes to both Chief Holmquist and Chief Kendall. And so you guys just kind of like jumped right into things here, and I think have made an impact on a short period of time and have dealt with, pretty big succession issues very successfully. So I think you do deserve a lot of credit for that in terms of your leadership and impact in a short period of time. So thank you for that. And it's clearly your services are highly valued and a high level of satisfaction from people in the community. I did have 2 quick questions for you. One is, I'm still stupefied by why, and you answered it a little bit in terms of the question about why is there such a big response in terms of fire trucks, for example, to calls. And I had someone on my street who couldn't fix their fire alarm, and we had 2 fire trucks and a couple of leadership folks there and a captain as well. And it was like, so it seemed like it was, ample response. My question for you is, though, related to staffing. And Rich, you mentioned that you had a 300% increase in calls or something like that over the past year, and that was due mainly to COVID. Do we ever expect that curve is going to taper, and that maybe our staffing line that we drew do we drive that too high? Because it does seem to me that we're trying to cure a lot of ills in one cycle with 4 full-time positions, when part of it is due to ensuring staffing 24 hours. And part of it is to deal with the shortfalls that we're having in terms of the per diems. And some of this goes all the way back to not having volunteers anymore. So it just seems kind of high to me. Is that based on the 300% increase, or do you expect that it's going to taper off a little bit? Maybe we don't have to do 4 positions in a year.
So I apologize if I did say 300%. It was 300 calls
I'm sorry,
for the year. So
30%, did you say?
Yeah, about, yeah. So
You got my 3s mixed up, sorry, and my 0s.
and to answer your question, one of the my staff and we did talk about, preparing for the question of when does this plan end, or what is the end game for this plan? And as I mentioned, one of our goals over the next year is to really dig into this and understand, are we looking at the right things? Are we looking at the right deployment? Are the trucks in the right place? Are the staff in the right place to try and engage some of those questions, get those questions answered for you? And unfortunately, I don't have those answers for you today, but
I appreciate your diligence and your focus on that, and we'll look forward to hearing back from you. One other thing I just want to say in closing is that sort of a good news and bad news aspect to being an aggregator, to being a provider of services to more than one locality. So we talked about the ambulance response rate and that sort of thing, and the fact that, we basically are taking on responsibilities for other towns, and, that includes staffing and costs and making sure we're breaking even. So I just ask for us to be vigilant about that and mindful of that, particularly in an environment which is likely to be with us for a long time in terms of ever increasing costs ramping, not only in terms of equipment, but also in terms of services, number one. And number two, it's just, I don't think people are going to want to take those services back. They're going to want to rely on us to keep doing that. And we want to make sure that we're we're not just taking on burdens and then not somehow ensuring that we're going to break even or at least make this a, you know, we're going to keep ourselves in the black. So you know, and it's not an easy answer, but I would just ask for you to be, you know, we're going to look to you to help us understand how to manage that.
Just in terms of the fire side of things, to Councilor Hamill's comment, unlike the police department where we have actual contractual agreements with other communities, I mean, the fire service is based largely on mutual aid, and that means we're there to help each other and vice versa. Sometimes that gets out of balance, but that's really the cornerstone of the fire service. There's one example of cooperation with the town of Gorham that we've actually made some changes this year because it was inequitable. We were both staffing the North Scarborough Fire Station, and we found over a series of years, frankly, that we were shouldering most of those costs or more than we should have. And we've made arrangements to correct that imbalance. But I just can't underscore the importance of mutual aid. We cannot do this without our partner neighboring communities, and nor can they.
And I hope it would give you some comfort that we call it the York County Metro Chiefs that we do a lot of mutual aid with. We're all facing the same things you just mentioned. We're trying to make sure that what we send is equitable, and we've all made changes to our run cars. So, you know, I can't send you 3 fire trucks when you need, you know, we're going to send you just what we can based on what we have available and in a mutual arrangement. So all the chiefs in the area are working towards that goal that you mentioned.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
A couple counselors would like to take a 5-minute recess before we turn it over to the school department. So we will go ahead and recess for 5 minutes and reconvene at 5:25.
I said.
Next up.
They say the camera ads?
10 pounds.
I am not. in
Yes.
any position to have any pounds added.
Welcome back, everybody. Just to recap, this is the Town Council Finance Committee meeting for Tuesday, May 3rd, and we are coming back from recess, and we are welcoming our colleagues on the school department.
All right, thank you. Well, I'd like to, I'll start and just introduce our budget and finance guru, Kate, and also Shannon, our board chair, and Jenna, our finance committee chair, who are here this evening. And we're going to just start, and some of these first slides may be a bit of a repeat from our budget hearing at the end on the 30th of March, but wanted to just first kind of ground our presentation this evening with really the big themes from this year as far as our school department, both in terms of, what this year has been like for our staff, our students, our families, our board, our community, as we're returning to full-time in-person instruction. So listening a little bit to the fire chief talking about how all of a sudden calls are up again and it's like the whole community is back to life and whoa, okay, we're full-time again. Definitely an equivalent experience this year in terms of having all of our kids back, having all of our staff back, having what felt like an almost monthly shift in health and safety protocols. 2/3 of the year, our staff and teachers working diligently, and all of our kids fully masked. A lot of learning recovery and social emotional needs, obviously, and not just for our students, for our staff and for our families. This has been a unique year, and I know that that's been, probably an overused expression, but certainly the experiences of returning to full-time instruction, so many positives outweighing the challenges. But really, as we've gone through, and I would also just note that in using a lot of the federal COVID money, how Scarborough did to make sure that we were properly staffed, frankly, has been a real help to maintain that in-person instruction this year. There have been a lot of staffing shortages, a lot of teachers covering for other teachers, administrators covering for teachers, high school staff coming down to help out with the middle school shortage. So there's been just a lot of collective problem solving and challenges through this year. And really, and thinking about that theme, really having the resilience and then also the capacity to work through those disruptions to maintain a continuity of learning for our kids. And that certainly is applicable from, fully remote in the spring of 2020 to hybrid for the last school year, and then now to this fully return to full instruction. And so when we started the budget development process this year, we're really balancing the needs of our students and moving that forward into this upcoming year, and taking us through this year. And with a lot of the additional economic impacts of what we've been through this year, from the staff shortages and some of the hiring challenges that we continue to face, and then really some still lingering uncertainty around enrollment and community demographics, both now and in the short term. And we're going to talk about that a little bit towards the end of the slides, because we've had some enrollment fluctuations even since our last presentation, and even since our first reading with the school board. So, but a lot of those supply chain disruptions too that we've heard from other departments, obviously are impacted at the school department level. And then also making sure that we're continuing to make progress with our own kind of core goals and initiatives as a staff, whether it's our diversity, equity, inclusion, social emotional learning supports for our kids, and our own professional learning and curriculum development, as there's been so much rapid change in pedagogy and how we teach, and then how, as I said before, maintain that learning continuity through all of the disruptions that we've had. And then just to review our development process, our budget development process, which again, through this past year, even though there's been some unique challenges this year, we've really continued to adopt a similar budget development process. And I just credit our leadership council, our board, our central office team, all of our staff really have just been so participatory and thoughtful in starting, with getting as much input as possible in December through work, through leadership, and Colt really looking at our salary and benefit projections into January, getting into all the buildings, listening to the staff, really looking deeply at our enrollment analysis. The last couple of years, we've gotten an idea of what our state subsidy was going to be pretty early. So that has certainly been helpful in planning. And then just starting to refine as we go and go through completing our budget book, being able to share publicly at our town budget presentation through February and into March, and now April with our first school board public hearing, and then now with the second reading coming up. So again, and where we landed and what we've presented at our first reading and then also at the budget presentation, an increase of 6.4% in total education budget with an increase in a tax request of 5.31%. The next two slides, just again to highlight, and I just think this bears repeating, the overwhelming majority of our expenditures as a school department are salaries and wages and benefits for our personnel and for our teachers and support and administrators. We're in a people business. When we look at kind of moving our programs and keeping what we have and improving and strengthening them into the next school year, that increased costs and some of the budget drivers are really entirely focused around people and our wages and salaries. And then that second pie and the next slide for personnel expenditures, I would just highlight between the blue Pac-Man and then the larger slice. What's that color?
That's
It's like
pizza.
it's not really a red. It's kind of it's almost almost like a
Brick.
more of a salmon brick color of educational support staff. That's upwards of close to 75% of our personnel expenditures really grounded in the classroom and grounded in making sure we're supporting our needs of kids in the classroom. And then some of our cost drivers, as we've mentioned before, really when we're looking at a level services budget, which is really taking all of our personnel and all of our programs and moving them forward into the next fiscal year, a lot of that increase in costs focuses, again, because it's such a overwhelmingly large piece of the pie is wages and personnel costs, our collective bargaining agreements. We've started negotiations with our largest collective bargaining, or our largest group, which is the teachers, the SEA. Also health insurance rate increases. So we did have, we did budget for that increase, but it's actually higher than what had been budgeted. So that was, we just got some additional information, which again, we'll touch base a little bit on some of our adjustments as I get later in the presentation. But really an additional challenge for us in terms of resources is how do we step down from this loss of federal grant funding, and also pretty flat, at least as Scarborough's concerned with our subsidy, flat state funding. How do we start to step back from that? And then we've had some considerable surplus in the last couple of years, and then how are we using that fund balance to help step that down so that we're not facing a fiscal cliff? So one of the things that we've been able to do is some of that federal COVID money was to hire staff to lower and keep class sizes at a manageable and even decrease through COVID. How do we step down from that as we kind of get back into a more normalized resourcing of schools really in our school department? So that's been an additional challenge that we've been facing as we've been developing this budget this year. And then really, taking care of our kids, maintaining that educational continuity, and supporting the needs of our learners through added personnel and special services, academic support, and as well as counseling. Part of also remote and hybrid learning has been a significant investment in instructional technology. And along with that is continuing to take care of that investment, protect it and enhance it, and then also continue to focus on strengthening how we use technology in the classroom to enhance learning. I think this one is Kate's favorite slide. Am I right? Because it's
Dawn's favorite slide.
Or it's Dawn's. We have very, she gets the pencil out and we go line by line. And so our building leaders and leadership council, I'm sure this is not their favorite part of the budget process, but really digging in to their building-based budgets and finding places where we can save. So these are just some bullets that we've already shared, just some examples of that in places where we can actually reduce our expenditures and budget from one year to the next. Some of the major additions, and again, I give so much credit to our leadership council, who, and one part of this process is we get together as a K-12 leadership team and have everybody come to the table with their needs and requests for their building, but then they have to take on a K-12 hat and they have to look at each other's priorities and really say, okay, how does this measure up to the needs of another school or another department, and go through that process in such a way that when we come out of it, the things that we need are ones that have been vetted by the entire leadership council, and we've come to a degree of consensus on what is truly needed to support our kids at every phase level. And through that process came with these major bullets. Again, you'll see the focus on specialized student support for learning, whether it's through, a study center program, social worker positions, or added special services support for kids. Also adding, again, to our unified program, which has, I just think, a massive impact on our special education and general education community, both. So that's outlined and really, I think represents a very fiscally conservative and controlled list of ads here. And then just another bullet outlining how the federal grant monies are still being used to again step down from some of the additional positions that were hired through the use of federal COVID funds. Some of the things that we continue to fund in that area are four of the 8 original teacher positions, an additional guidance or one guidance counselor for the K-2 schools, and then some specialized activities taking us through the summer for further support for kids. The next slide is just really outlining capital projects and equipment across the areas of technology, facilities, and transportation. If there's anything you wanted on that slide you wanted to
I think it's all pretty
emphasize?
standard stuff. Yes, there's specific.
And then finally, and we actually just circulated a little more specifics around these, just some items that are in motion. And still continue to fluctuate as we go through the budget cycle and in between the two readings. First, as I mentioned, we had budgeted for a 6% increase in Anthem rates for health insurance. The actual is 7.9%. So that's an increase of 128,000 over what we had budgeted. We get 10,000 of that back because the Delta rates didn't go up, Delta Dental. So there's that.
Yay.
Yay. Saves us 10 grand. Personnel cost estimates, we continue to refine. So that's really the variable there is, we do have actually quite a few teacher retirements. And then, so when those positions open up and then we replace with new staff, the estimates of what that is going to cost is obviously we're refining and changing as we get closer to the end of the year. So that's starting to get a little bit more into focus. As I mentioned, the enrollment, we were starting to project the possibility of needing one fewer classroom at the K-2 level, which, and that was just maybe a month ago when we were talking about that. And then just within the last few weeks have had a significant uptick in enrollment at the kindergarten level and at that K-2 phase level. So no longer in a position where we feel like we can lose that classroom or that teacher at the K-2 level. And then special education enrollment continues to grow. One of the challenges this year too is when we compare the number of students who are referred for special services, it's significantly higher than in other years or previous years. So that's also a potential item in motion. That's where we are. We have been able to make some adjustments and make some overall reductions in terms of cost projections and budget adjustments in preparation for the second reading that we can go through.
Would you like this sheet shared?
I think Liam has that.
Do we have that
document now.
electronically?
I just
Oh,
sent it to
okay.
Tom a little bit ago.
Great. Kate, you want to walk through?
You want to hear from me some? Sure
You captivating
I am.
and Easter colors.
Always,
By the way.
always. These guys even know that. It's like,
Or
only pastel things may come before this council.
non-denominational spring-like colors. How about
Right,
that?
perfect.
Sorry.
So I'll apologize right off that the numbers that we showed in the items in motion slide have actually changed. This document that we're looking at was finalized how many hours ago? 2, something like that. So we've been working hard. And what Liam's showing you is at the top of the grid is the budget that the school board approved at first reading on March 17th. That's the budget that you all have before you in terms of what you've been reviewing. The budget adjustments are in this nice little blue block in the middle. As Jeff called out, most of what we've been looking at, virtually everything that we've been looking at has something to do with personnel. We have, first of all, as Jeff mentioned, we have a number of retirees, and this year we have an especially large number of retirees at the high school. I don't think you know any of them. And so at the high school, enrollment in class size is kind of an interesting exercise because it's quite different from classroom teachers that, every classroom teacher has 20 kids or what you're used to in the lower grades, because they have the 5 different core content areas, they have AP courses, they have electives. And so we have an opportunity at the high school because students select their courses right now. They're in the process of doing that, and that should be finished up in the next week or so. We can see some opportunity for a reduction. We haven't nailed down exactly where that's going to be, but we have a feeling that we can let one of those retirement positions go unfilled And so Sue Ketch, our high school principal, has been working really hard on trying to make sure that all the kids' needs are met, that they're able to get the sections that they need in their schedules, and that we can do that with one less position. The second one is to move the K-12 tech specialist to ESSER 3, and that's, you got to go backwards a little bit for that story. In our acronym land, right? ESSER 3 is the last COVID-related grant that we got from the feds. It's really ARP, just like you guys have ARPA, ESSER. And in our grant proposition for the current year, for FY22, we requested a K-12 tech specialist. And that role is kind of a bridge between tech integrators or tech coaches in the, that work with teachers in the classroom, and then the folks that work on the IT side of the systems and the devices and so forth. Because we have not been able to find a person to fill that position in FY22, and here we are in May, we have decided to defer that hire through no choice of our own. But the idea was that in FY23, we would have already had that person. And similar to some of the other situations where we're coming off of the federal grants, we were going to hang on to that person and roll that position into the operating budget. So what we're proposing to do now is to defer it again, keep it in the grant for FY23, and then come back to you in FY24 and say, hey, we found someone and they're great. The $10,000 reduction is simply the cost estimate difference between two ed techs, which projected cost would be $90,000, and one open teacher position for which the projected cost is $80,000. That's happened because, as Jeff mentioned, our needs in special education are changing and rolling, and our special education director has said, I could really use another teacher. So I have a teacher of record rather than the additional ed techs. Will make do with ed techs. The next piece is to use the remaining balance of the ESSER 3 grant. And again, we'd written the grant to include a certain number of positions in FY22, and having done the budget to actual calculations now at the end of Q3, we see that we're going to have some money left. We're going to have a little bit of money left in what we had budgeted for teachers. So we proposed to apply that remaining $45,000 to another teacher position. So instead of dropping from 8 positions down to 4 positions, ESSER funded, as you saw in that earlier slide, now it's more like 4.5. So one of the positions that's currently in our operating budget will be partially funded through ESSER. There's a COVID-related IT device replacement line in there, and I think this goes to a question that Councillor Johnson had when John Day was here talking about IT and what kind of grant funds might be available. We had already budgeted in fiscal 22, again in that ESSER 3 grant, for a bunch of different IT devices and software replacement that were justifiably COVID related. And we will have $25,000 left over from that ask. So we will propose to reduce the IT budget, again, operating budget in 23, and use the ESSER funds. The remainder of this chart is all about salary and benefit costs. And as Jeff alluded to, we have, again, a lot of retirements. We have positions that we've actually already filled. It's a little bit convoluted, but we ask our retirees, or they're required under contract to let us know by January 1st whether they're going to retire. And that's because in our teacher contract, there's a provision for retirees to be paid a portion of their sick time when they leave. And so when we build the budget in January, we're building a budget and we're saying, here's a list of 20 people who are going to retire, and we need to budget for their per diem sick days because we know they're entitled to those. So a piece of that 106,000 is transitioning from, I needed that money to pay them their retirement stipend, to I'm not going. I changed my mind. I didn't really mean it. I'm going to stay on for another year. And that's great. So I can take the stipend out of the budget. I don't need to pay it to them this year. I'll pay it to them next year. As you heard, Anthem rates went up. That's a little bit more refined number from what you saw on the earlier slide, which was a rounding. Delta rates only went down by $8,300, not the whole $10,000. These are all impacts to the general fund. And you know that we do have adult education. We have people in adult ed and we have people in school nutrition. But right now we're just focusing on the general fund budget because that's where the big swing is. And in those other budgets, we're going to be able to absorb the increase with Anthem, the decrease with Delta. The work comp reductions they'll all balance out, so we don't need to make changes. The last item here on the benefits list is work comp, and we have our workers' compensation insurance through MEMIC. And this is the time of year when they're working on our renewal. And so we've given them our estimates of what our payroll is going to be in the coming year. They've been taking a look at our loss ratios and they've let us know that they think that we don't have a bill yet, but they think that our bill is going to be slightly less than what we had budgeted. And the last item is audit expenses. And I think Tom probably spoke about that, or Ruth did when we were talking on the town side. The school department pays a portion of the audit fees each year because the school department has special things that we need for audit. And so Tom and Ruth were gracious enough to include me in their process. And so this is the amount of the increase in the audit services for next year that the school department will be expected to pay. So that's our total. And then down at the bottom is a revised summary of what the school budget looks like as we move into second reading with the school board on Thursday. You see that the education gross budget is now down to 5.99%. That's Walmart pricing right there. And the education net budget is down to 4.84%, the tax pass. The second page is capital. And I don't know if you guys want me to take a breath. If you have questions, I should just keep talking.
Keep going.
Go. All right. The capital budget has no financial impact to the changes, but we do want the board to be able to look at the changes that we're making. And what we've done is we've done some changes in the projects that we're proposing. In the technology budget, Jen actually spoke to the replacement switches for the high school when she did her presentation here, because she had already made that decision that she needed to trade that project, which was more critical and where they were experiencing some failure, for the Phonak wiring upgrade, which she felt could be deferred. So we're taking out the Phonak wiring upgrade. We'll see that again next year. We'll talk about it some more. And we're replacing it with the switches for the high school. Enrollment Express is a virtual, how can you say virtual paperwork? That's an oxymoron, but it's a way to fill out forms online. Again, Jen has brought that to the fore as a priority because of some compliance issues in terms of the paperwork that we send around electronically. And in our recent hybrid environment, it's become really obvious that we need to have a different solution that's encrypted and safe. And the last thing on her list was that her interactive projectors, which were on her initial proposal for school CIP, the projectors replacement project, when she went out for quotes, they didn't give her the right number for interactive projectors. They gave her the number for just the basic projectors, but a number of the classrooms at the high school have interactive projectors and they're in heavy use. So that's a swap. And the other swap makes me really sad. School boards heard me cry about this, but we had this really cool robot floor cleaner in our budget. It sounds so silly, but you see them at, like, Sam's Club has one.
It's a commercial size Roomba.
Yeah, exactly. It's a super cool thing, and we were going to name it and give it little eyes and put a hat on it. And, but to be serious, we have had so much trouble hiring. You've heard this from everybody, right? So we've had so much trouble hiring custodial help. and finding good workers, that everybody who's currently on our custodial staff is out straight, and a lot of their time is spent pushing these big old floor cleaners around or riding on one. You know, just the cafeteria at the high school takes an hour to clean the floors. So the scheme behind the robot floor cleaner is that you can set the robot floor cleaner, you program it, and it can be going around and doing the cafeteria at the high school, while meanwhile, the human beings with brains and skills can be going and doing other work, right? So that was a nice dream for a little while. And then we found out that when we are going to go and replace one of our boilers at one of the K2 schools, that the other boiler in that same school was failing. So we are swapping the really sexy robot floor cleaner for the really boring HVAC repair that we really need to do. Good old HVAC. And I did make a note that we had proposed to use our new capital reserve fund for the robot floor cleaner, as well as a couple of other items. And so since we really need the HVAC more, and we did not want to impact the tax ask on our CIP, we're just going to trade that funding source as well, just to keep our net capital budget at a zero, or the change at a zero.
Questions and comments for school department?
I have a question.
Go for it, Ken.
Very limited questions for the school, because I understand my, my position with it. This is a question for Tom. Tom, and this is embarrassing, but you know what? I don't hesitate to embarrass myself. The equipment for the school, the capital equipment budget, how's that funded? Is that bonded, or does that come right into the tax ask?
It depends on the item. I can direct your attention to,
The total that we've got for this year, for 2023, average is total of 979. Is that all into the ask? None of that's bonded?
So
If you look at-
Ken, in our budget book,
Yep.
Page
in the
35.
capital budget, the school budget is in that capital budget, and for each of those items, it's coded with how we were gonna pay for
page
it.
35 is all that's contained in one page.
All right, then I get some work to do. I'll go back to that.
So it's a series of bonded items.
I was just wondering about
Yep. Which one in particular?
the tracking software, 120,000 on the tracking software for the bus tracking. What is
That's
that?
appropriated, I believe. Was it
Is that
bonded?
Bonded?
It's supposed to be bonded. It's an implementation of a whole new program. So once we have, well, I should.
What's a track?
It's going to track who's on the bus, what kids are
Oh,
on the
okay.
bus.
Actually, the children on the
what
bus.
Bus they're supposed to be on, and
That way a mother calls up, where's my kid?
where's my kid, kind of
It's on
stuff
bus
like that.
22, we
yeah.
don't know?
Yeah,
Okay.
it'll have a few more features than
Yeah.
that, but,
Right, I mean, and, you know, part of it is like the days of dropping a child off and picking a child off at the same house 5 days a week. It just doesn't happen that way. It's much more complicated with our bus drivers, when kids are getting off and they're either, and where they're being dropped off or they're being picked
Yeah,
up.
you definitely see the need of that, then. Thank you for answering that.
Ken, this actually reminds me, I don't mean to interrupt, but we do have some questions that came up on the school side that didn't come up on the town side, and that was one of them. So I'm gonna make sure that I share out the response to that question, because it has a little.
Add
more
it to
detail.
our FAQ.
Right, the Q and
Yeah,
A.
great.
Councilor Johnson, just Liam was able to pull up, this is page 35 of the budget book. The column to the right of the shaded column are the requests for FY 23. That's the key. And the CRS are the three items that Kate
Yes.
alluded to, that's using school capital reserve school is what that stands for.
Yeah, there's
They're
a
gonna-
difference there between the 70,000 for the robot vacuum. There's another 29,000 in there for high school bleachers.
Now, after the use of your capital reserve funds, is there a balance in any of those funds?
Yes, we were accorded the exciting amount of $488,000 this year. It's the first time we've had one. And you may recall last year when we got that extra subsidy.
That's
at
right,
the end
that's
of
where
the
you
year,
put it?
That's where we put it, and we haven't actually got it yet. We won't get it till we have the last
Right.
payment of subsidy. But once we do, it's $488,000, and this proposal is to use about half of that, 199.
Does that 120 qualify for the balance of that 488
Does 120
for the software
plus
tracking? Just a question.
Sure,
It
then it'd
could.
be gone.
Yeah, it's-
Yeah.
you control the use of the
Yeah.
reserve, what
Right.
reserve funds are used for.
Another silly question, because Anthem is in the news an awful lot lately, and it's not really a positive thing. Are we bound to using Anthem? And I'm assuming the town uses Anthem also. Is that correct, Tom?
Yes.
Are we bound to using Anthem? We can't go across state lines and find.
I don't
better
mean to
provider
steal
that's
the,
not getting.
I don't mean to steal Kate's thunder, but we both belong to health trusts, and they're both essentially self-insured health trusts, but Anthem is the administrator of it. So
okay.
we subscribe to Anthem Networks. I believe that's true for Maine School Management. Is that correct?
It's actually, yeah, MEA benefits.
MEA Benefits Trust. Okay, uses the Anthem Network as
So
long
we're
as Maine Municipal.
self-funded and it's not Anthem rates.
It's administered by Anthem is my understanding. Kate, you
So
can
our
correct that.
increases in all this is the self-funding of that, right?
It's a little bit complicated on the school side. It's a relationship between the MEA Benefits Trust, which is a
Right.
subsidiary of the
Okay.
teachers union,
Yeah.
and the whole state of Maine. They negotiate prices with Anthem.
Right.
So we're getting this sort of massive group rate.
Yeah. You're probably bound by that too, because it's MMA.
Yes, and I think, without giving you the 7-year story on this, because Tom will remember sitting together with insurance agents trying to figure out how we could do exactly that. Can we go to Harvard Pilgrim? Can we go to Aetna?
Right.
Why are we stuck with this?
Yeah.
The short answer to that is that all retirees from Scarborough Public Schools belong to our group.
Yeah.
So if we were to go ask Harvard Pilgrim to insure us, they would say, well, who are all of
Right.
these old people
Right.
on your books,
It's not,
right?
it's not like a existing condition, right?
Right, exactly. And the other piece, on the positive side, the MEA Benefits Trust actually puts a lot of money into the program. So they're buying down the premiums before we even see them. And we're getting a better group rate that way than we would if we just went straight to Anthem as an insurance company.
Has anybody explained to us, I mean, because it's not us, it's all your municipalities, what's driving all these rate increases? Anthem, what's driving it?
Last year, Anthem for the schools was flat, which is to me what's driving it, because if you hold things flat and your prices go up,
Catch up.
you're gonna
Catch
get
up.
whacked. It's not, our increase is not hugely more than what I expected. Unfortunately, it's more. I wanted it to be less. I budgeted for 6% and we got 7.9.
Right.
So it's not outrageously different from what I expected.
Right.
But I think what we're seeing, and Tom can speak to this too, is that the insurance companies were reeling. They were unclear on how to actually
Deal with
estimate what it
COVID.
was that
Right.
they needed to get from their participants to pay for COVID. They just kind of went, we don't
And then they
know
were mandated to pick up the cost on
exactly on so many
testing, all
things,
kinds of
right?
things. Right.
And so
Okay.
now, 2 years later, they're going, oh, gosh, we
Right.
need to make some money.
Right.
So I'm sure
Yeah,
Tom's
okay.
gonna see that as
You
well.
know, insurance commodities are largely experience rated, and generally speaking, municipal employees and school employees are generally older and therefore likely sicker or require higher health costs than do the general population. So if you look at us as a from an experience point of view, we're more expensive than the general population.
Not a great demographic.
That's all I have. April. Thank you.
Go ahead, John.
I just have a question, or I have a couple questions, but one is about special services. So since you guys are increasing staff to support special services, it seemed like because of the incoming kindergartners needed additional services, was my understanding of reading the material. Do those employees, do they service those children throughout their lifetime, or are they just certified to do it for elementary age students? And then in the future, we would anticipate seeing additional special service needs for them as they age through the schools.
Yeah, good question. I think when you're talking about education technicians, ed techs,
Mhm.
they're certified K-12. So and in a lot of cases, the ed techs will actually move up with the students as they go up through the grades. If they have a particular bond, if they're working one-on-one with a kid. Sometimes they stay in their phase level because that's where they're most effective. And sometimes then the child is passed on to a new group of professionals. When it comes to special education teachers, they do tend to stick mostly to their phase level, just mostly because of experience. I believe they're certified K-8 and 9-12. But I think your question is, do we need to get 2 more people and then 2 more people and then 2 more people as we go up? The ed techs are always moving around the district based on the students' needs. So as students graduate, new kids are coming in, we're always shifting and moving. And one of the reasons why Allison asked to convert her request for 2 ed techs to a teacher was because the numbers were really going up at Wentworth School where they needed an additional classroom. And she felt that she could redeploy the ed techs that she currently has to make sure that with that new teacher that they could cover the kids' needs.
Okay, great.
And I would just add also for incoming kindergarten students who may have special needs or work with CDS, sometimes it's temporary where they need a one-on-one ed tech, or, it's a lot of these students haven't been in a classroom environment full-time before. So in some cases, they may need continuing support, individualized support, and in others, it may be temporary or even short-term. So
Like a transitional
Right.
moment. Yeah.
Tom, you said something when Counselor Johnson was asking questions about the reserves.
Mhm.
And I just want to make sure I understood or heard you correctly. When he asked the question about using reserves to fund the tracking, the bus tracking, you made it sound like the council has the authority to determine how those reserves are spent. Was that?
I don't know if it's a council or the Board of Education. It's made in this room. It's not
So you-
unlike ARPA or TIF revenues. There's no other, we define what the purposes of those funds are for.
But it's not the council, like is it the Board of Education who would make that decision when it comes to?
I guess
school
I need to
reserves?
tread lightly. Just because I don't know the answer to the question. It was the council that directed that the fund be created in the first place. And I think the BOE understood the value in that. In terms of programming its use, I would expect it's a collaborative process.
Okay.
I think our assumption was that we would run it through the budget process. So in a sense, we're going to be collaborative unless there's an emergency, in which case then we would have to decide who's the boss of it.
Yeah, case in
But
point, Kate presented the capital plan, Kate and Jeff, and I sat down with Kate and said, which of these, if any, would you propose that you could use use the reserve funds for? And she came up with those 3. So that's kind of how it evolved this year.
Okay, I just wasn't sure if it was the school board's authority to decide, or that we could get that specific with them on how those reserve funds could be leveraged.
Well, at the risk of having a fight with Tom on camera.
I don't mean to be opening a fight. I just was curious in the comment.
I think because the origin of the funds is state GPA, it's general purpose aid for schools. I think we could make an argument that the board would need to at least direct the spending. But here we are, we talk and collaborate.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, council has bottom line budget authority, that's all. But luckily, we enjoy a good collaborative relationship and can have this level of conversation, which sometimes gets fairly specific.
Right. I would compare it to the school impact fees account. I had asked Tom for an update on the balance and what we were using. Ruth typically budgets a pretty healthy portion of those fees to pay down debt service. And so, in terms of us having authority over that, it's more, this is the recommendation of the staff. And, if we wanted to reduce the overall budget, it's up to the staff to decide
How to do it.
ultimately how they want to
Okay.
allocate that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
That is something that we were talking about earlier about the, and we found the line item where it's used in the current proposal.
Just another question. Again, I don't know if I'm asking too detailed of questions, but I'm gonna ask them. When it comes to facilities and maintenance, I just was curious. When, with the 10% increase, does that include the CIP items that are appropriated in that increase, or is that just operating?
That's just operating.
Okay.
It's the, when you're looking at the overall chart of the individual, I think you were looking at the one with all the different
Mhm.
budget pieces, the sections of the school budget,
Yeah.
that's all general fund operating.
Okay.
And I think that might be one of the questions that came up in the FAQ, but the increase in facilities for the most part has to do with energy. There's really two pieces to it. One is a new collective bargaining agreement, which
Mhm.
is great because we haven't been able to hire anybody for 3 years because we're really pretty low. Hence the robot floor cleaner. But the biggest piece of it is the energy cost, and you've heard it from everybody. I mean, the projections we're getting for keeping these nice, big, great school buildings running with natural gas and electricity and
Mhm.
even oil, it's just nuts.
Yep.
That accounts for probably $250,000-$300,000.
One thing, Jeff, you recently sent out the email around the turf and track replacement, and you mentioned the 600,000 deficit. I'm just curious if the school board has had the opportunity to talk about where does that fit in the CIP in future years, if there's going to be a need to plug that $600,000 in to make up for that, or some other estimate. So I don't know if that's been discussed, that we would be seeing that updated in the CIP at some point.
We haven't discussed it specifically. I mean, initial discussions around that is, once we have clarity over, potential sites and that's been excluded, then the second phase of that is obviously track replacement.
Mhm.
And so the balance of what's left would, at least initially would be put towards the cost of replacing the track.
So, yeah, and I think one of the questions, the biggest question we have is about timing, like when are decisions going to be made? And knowing that the biggest emergency is to get the field operational so that it's not shut down. Portioning that piece of it off. If we then, if the decision is made that that's still going to be our athletic facility and there's no other use for it, then when we go into the second phase, we're likely to be into the summer of the beginning of fiscal year 23.
Four.
Yes. 4.
Okay.
So there isn't anything represented in the fiscal 23 budget simply because we wouldn't be able to make a decision and move forward with the planning for that until the summer of 23.
Okay.
Summer of 23 fiscal.
And then when it comes to bond and items in your CIP, like the roof restoration, since that's over the $400,000 threshold for the charter, when I read the charter language, it's not clear to me if that would be something that would have to go to voters for approval, or how the charter would address that one particularly.
This is a question that was in your questions. I remember some numbers. So that total cost in CIP is 11 small individual projects.
Oh, okay.
And so each one of those projects would be contracted separately. They run from $12,000 to $55,000 a piece. And they're scheduled differently based on, the way that we can get access to a school without disrupting education. So even though you're seeing that one big number, you're seeing a bunch of smaller projects folded into that dollar amount. So we wouldn't typically think of that as like a one item.
Okay, that makes sense. So I just assumed it was one roof, and I was like, wow, that's a big roof. Okay.
Look at the back of the town budget book. I think it's on page 173. There's a surprise, it's a pastel colored grid that has more detail about the individual projects. There you go, you get your hand on it. So if you look under roof restoration, you can see just, I think it just has a sentence there that says this is
Yep.
multiple projects.
I must have skipped that page. So, but thank you.
And the charter requirement for voter approval for items over 400,000, it goes on to specify a single capital project
Yep.
or item.
Like an
I think is the word.
item, yeah.
Having 11 different parts to it, we have legal advice that does not meet the threshold.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, it kind of reminds me of things like if you're buying $400,000 worth of laptops.
Yeah.
to Buying $400,000 worth of $200 things.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think Tom has gotten a lot of advice over the years about what really constitutes a referendum item and what doesn't.
And the charter revisions intend to help clarify some of that language.
And then my last question, the big question, and it's a question that I've gotten from a few residents. So everybody knows about the consolidated school, but again, that number there was no number in the CIP for the consolidated school. So can you guys just talk to why you chose not to put anything in there at this point?
I'm sure how to address that. Yeah,
Apparently you don't need any.
John, do you mean for planning costs or the actual building?
The actual building.
I mean, I think that's a hard thing to do, right? Because whatever number we put in there, we don't have a solid estimate to use at this point. I think it feels a little alarming to just make up a number and.
We don't want to be wrong about it.
yeah.
Right.
Well, and it would be in the 5-year plan. It wouldn't be in the coming year.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think a placeholder wouldn't be a bad thing to have, but what would that number be? And how do you come up with a responsible figure when you haven't even selected a site or?
Mhm.
I think there's other steps first before.
Yeah.
Before
And I
that.
think that's fair. I just, that's a question that we're getting
Say
is,
it out loud.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's,
Mhm.
it makes sense. Like, I agree, like, we shouldn't put anything in the CIP that we're not ready. Because there's still work to be done. I just know because it's out there, people are wondering like, well, what is it gonna cost? And
Right,
Yeah.
where is it?
Yeah.
Well, and you've had a lot of conversations about the library and the fact that's been on the books for a long time, and you actually have a number there because you've got
Mhm.
plans drawn and a proposal made, so it's different.
They're at a different stage.
But, we should be getting to that stage and
Mhm.
making those same
Mhm.
statements.
Mhm.
Question is, how did Kristen just take over that meeting?
Well, I did ask.
Kristen
William
from
to
above.
come here.
Power of technology.
John, did you want to ask any questions on
Yeah,
this?
I have a couple questions.
Okay. I thought you might.
Yeah. So, a number of us have been at this for a few years, right? This dance that we do, this municipal, Board of Ed dance. And we've tried a lot of things. We tried setting first and second reading percentages. We battled over net versus gross. We made finance committee recommendations that went to the board and were kind of accepted but never voted on. I mean, we've tried virtually everything we could think of in terms of trying to make the process easier. So what I'd like to say at the outset is, in spite of my questions over the course of this process, we're trending well and hopefully we'll have a good outcome. We have 3 targets. We've only really talked about one so far. We haven't talked about the other 2 targets in any great length, but those are the mill rate target, a gross expenditures target, and also a percent of debt service target. So we want to come in, we want to beat those numbers. My bias is we should be talking about those targets at every single meeting, okay? On both sides of the house. The frustration that I have is that the fact is that if you look at the big pie chart, it's a 2/3, 1/3 issue. 2/3 of the budget for the town of Scarborough is made up by the education segment. 1/3 of that pie is made up by the municipal side. You have a different governance system. You have different statutory background and limitations. You have a lot of other structural issues that, we may not have on the municipal side. But year in, year out, I am very frustrated by what seems that we follow the big dog up, and then the big dog follows us back down. So even at this stage where we have some good numbers trending in the right direction, and we got to hit at least $1.5 million of reductions, we've come up with over 50% of that from our smaller position. Okay. We have less to work with, but we come up with more dollars every year when it comes to this process. So someday, I hope that we'll be able to together build up from a number, and maybe we start off with a flatline number or something that only assumes a COLA increase, and we build from there. We're both building. We're not cutting. We're not having somebody lead and then we have somebody else has to cut. So that's my lamentation, here. I did have a quick question. It's hopefully we are going to get back to something that's more normal, as we move through COVID, and something that will obviously have other challenges. But how do we help me accounting for the credits and debits for COVID funding? So we have a grant, for example, for certain positions. You're showing us not using the grant, but using it someplace else. You had a slide here that showed that included a number of positions, and you showed that as a minus on your chart in terms of, or as a savings. So, but if you get funding for a year, and then how do you reverse that after 1 year? And we own the cost structure for a position that will run on indefinitely. Do we, is there some other credit, or do we just show it one way and then forget about it? Because I see that also on a lot of the discussion we had about staff increases in general. Those things tend never to go down. They constantly go up. Even if it's funded by the feds or by the state of Maine, we own it after year one. So can you help me with that? And I could give you I had this page number, but I lost it. It was the slide where you had
What was
COVID and puts and takes.
I'm trying to wrap my head around your question thoroughly, Dawn. I think basically the question is, if you have something that's grant funded this year, then next year is the expectation that it's going to be in the operating budget. And
it would show as an operating budget increase. So the credit and the increase would cancel themselves out over a year, but on an ongoing basis, we own it and we build it into our cost structure, right? Isn't that how it works?
Well, no, actually, the grant funded positions are not included in our operating budget. So this year, FY22, we have 8 teachers who are being paid by ESSER 3. In FY23, we're going to have 4.5 teachers that are paid by ESSER 3. And to your point, we're hoping that by the time we get to FY24, we can go back to normal class sizes.
Yeah, it's slide 8. F23 school operating budget reduces F22 funding. You have textbooks and so forth. These are like non-people related things. But in slide 9, you talk about added funding for certain positions, including a support tech and so forth.
So those people are not in our operating budgets. And so if we wanted to add them to our operating budget next year, if we said, okay, grant funds are gone, grant funded position is gone, they're only given a 1-year contract.
I see.
If they're
Okay.
a grant funded position.
Okay.
So if we said, we really need that extra teacher
I
at
see.
Wentworth School, then that's going to be a new ask for our operating budget in the ensuing year. It would
Great.
be a new proposal.
Thank
Right,
you.
and then also slide 10, talking about reducing the 8 grant funded positions down to 4.
Yeah.
So, and the thought there was not going from 8 to 0.
Yep.
In 1 year.
Well,
I
still
see.
trying to do COVID recovery. And
Right,
the fact that we did preserve some of our ESSER money for FY23,
Okay.
knowing that we didn't want to do
Right.
that.
Okay.
There's a pretty good grid someplace in the budget book I have before me. I'll try and find a page that talks about everything that we have funded. with,
Great.
COVID money over the past 2 years.
It's the beginning of that executive
And then
summary.
what the projection is for FY '23.
Great.
And then again, Don, if we were to say, well, we have this position in ESSER grant in the current year, but we really want to keep that position, then it becomes a new proposal in the operating budget.
So there'll be another discussion
It would
about
be
it. and
another
it's a-
discussion. It would be-
terrific.
It would be a.
That's great. That's the best explanation I've had about how to understand COVID money. Thank you. Very helpful. One quick question. I'm not trying to take shots at any particular role, but what does a guidance counselor for K-2 schools do?
So it's really the need for social emotional learning, particularly at the K-2 level or any level, is really taking into account a child's experience and family experience and a lot of that social emotional learning. So I mean, a guidance counselor right now at the K-2, we have social workers who are taking on caseloads for specific families, but then also a whole lot of guidance counselor duties at all 3 schools. So I mean, it's really about supporting a child's needs and that link, particularly at the K-2 level, as they're coming into a classroom environment between home and school.
Thank you.
Being that bridge.
That's helpful. I have, my youngest sister is an elementary art teacher in upstate New York. So she describes to me the sort of stuff that they deal with. So I get the social emotional needs demand for sure.
Shannon
yep.
gave me the page number 68 in your book, has a grid of all
Great.
of the federal grant stuff that the schools have been
Thank you.
given.
And then one final comment I wanted to make on this topic. I know we went back and forth on the issue of the turf and track and also the consolidated schools. So my only appeal here is that, and I know you're making efforts to do this. I read the superintendent's newsletter, which I thought was very well written and kind of outlined the problem statement very well. My only appeal is that, if we're going to err, we need to err on the side of having a public discussion about this. I know this is not in our bailiwick, but on our side, we're challenged with that all the time. I think it's just in order for us to get at the right answer, I think it's going to take, a lot of people thinking about it and talking about it and communicating what your decisions are and hearing what the public has to say about it. And so that at least all the stakeholders and everybody can feel as though they understand the rationale and what the plan is. So thank you.
So in the spirit of ending on a high note, I would like to thank the town manager and the superintendent school department for coming to the finance committee today with $800,000 on the town side and $234,837 for our consideration in updates and reallocations. And it just speaks to the fluid nature of the budget process. But it also speaks to the dedication and the hard work to help the town council better understand the budget and to also help us meet our budget goals. And so I sincerely appreciate the work that goes into these presentations and to bringing us the most updated and relevant information. So thank you for that. Are there any other questions for the school department? Okay, is there any public comment this evening? Seeing none. Is there any online, Liam? No. Okay, I will close public comment. Item number 7 is adjournment. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
All in favor?